Welcome to Challenging Colonialism, a podcast dedicated to amplifying the voices of Indigenous California. An important note from the start, the producers are two white male educator academics, and these are not our stories. This podcast will center Native voices, and our intention is to highlight the significant work being done by Indigenous communities to challenge ongoing colonialism and to broadcast information about the resistance and resilience of Indigenous California in the past, the present, and the future.
In this episode, we will hear an interview with Dr. Tony Platt, the award-winning author of 13 books and over 150 essays on race, inequality, and social justice in American history. He will be talking about his newest book, The Scandal of Cal: Land Grabs, White Supremacy, and Miseducation at UC Berkeley.
The book, The Scandal of Cal, and the previous book about 10 years earlier, Grave Matters, they both began as political projects. They didn't begin as, research projects in a typical academic way where you come up with a project and a proposal and you research it and write it. They both began politically. Grave Matters began up here in Big Lagoon, Humboldt, where I am now, working with the Yurok tribe and other indigenous organizations in Humboldt to deal with the legacies of grave robbing and looting. And then that book ended up in Berkeley as I traced the history of the trade in plunder and in ancestral remains to Berkeley. That's where it ended up. And then The Scandal of Cal, the more recent book, begins in Berkeley as a political project, working with the Truth and Justice Project to try to get the university to come clean about its history of plunder and accumulation and hoarding of artifacts and ancestral remains, and to get the university to do something about that. And so they started with a political project, with an activist project, and the research and the investigation came out of that. And in both cases, I now feel very strongly that whenever you do work taking on powerful institutions, particularly the University of California, which is one of the largest corporate-like institutions in the state of California, that you have to have an activist component to it as well. That universities, like any major institution, tries to protect its reputation and doesn't want to deal with these issues. And particularly around the indigenous history of California, which I've learned a lot more about in the last 10, 15 years and really neglected its significance. Before that, I used to teach and do a lot of work around race and the history of racism and race relations and so on. But Native American and indigenous history was always somewhat peripheral to that, or seen as sort of a separate project. And I didn't have the in-depth knowledge about that. So for me, this project became a learning experience about the centrality of the indigenous history in terms of California history and the history of the university. And it also became a learning experience about the university that I work in, that I was surprised to find that most people, like me until that point, don't investigate the place where they work. And there's very few critical histories of the university. It's almost as if academics don't want to bite the hands that are pulling them up the ladder, and can write critically and radically about all kinds of topics, but about the place where we are. So it took me a long time to come to that place. So this book, these two books have, they both support political projects. They're both trying to repair what are huge gaps and absences in California history. And they're also, in a sense, about myself trying to come to terms with how I've avoided topics like this until very late in my career, and I'm beginning to deal with that with these two books.
Yeah. And, thinking back, maybe a better place to start is with Grave Matters, because I think that's such a great and important book. But I know with this one, you make it very clear in the beginning, too, that in some ways, The Scandal of Cal is like a corrective study, right? Where you're going back and kind of looking at things that you overlooked with Grave Matters, which itself is, I think, a really important book that highlights a lot of history that's rarely talked about. I wonder if you could spend a few minutes, maybe kind of not getting too deep into Grave Matters, but talk a little bit about because what you talk about in there is about indigenous organizing and, the fight to protect cemetery sites up in way up in Northern California. And a lot of people don't know that history. Maybe you could kind of give a little bit of a background on some of the stuff that you uncovered with the book.
One of the things that struck me doing the research and reading for Grave Matters is the way in which popular texts and academic texts and high school and educational texts in general do not spend any time talking about the resistance of indigenous people in California. You get that image somewhat romantically described about indigenous fightbacks all over the rest of the country, but it's very silent in terms of California history. And in some of the textbooks, I found rather extraordinary statements like, indigenous people were so backward in California that they didn't even know that they were being conquered. They didn't have the ability to fight back. So I think this is a particular phenomenon in the popular culture and writings about California history, to the absence of any kind of sense of fight back or opposition and so on. So in Grave Matters, I was very fortunate to come across people who knew about the history of particular struggles that had taken place in Northern California around trying to defend village sites and trying to repatriate human remains and artifacts that had been plundered from those sites. That was NICPA, the Northwest Indian Grave Protection Association, that was multi-tribal and very militant and very active, and also developed allies and supporters at universities who worked with them. Not many, but enough to give them resources and a base of operation also from some universities. So I interviewed people that were in that organization and collected documents about that organization. And in a way, California was probably, I think, the first place in the United States to have indigenous organizations taking on the issue of repatriation. This was long before the federal government and national government began to deal with NAGPRA and make it a political, social, cultural issue nationwide. This happened long before that. So I always kept my eye out for that, and the absence of that and the difficulty of finding that material then made it more important to try to find people that knew that history and to talk to people who did that. And then when I was going around talking about grave matters in different places in California, people would always come and tell me their stories about how their family plundered things and how they had things in their attic or on their mantelpiece in their living room that they'd taken and so on. And when I was up in a bookstore in Ukiah, this one woman stood up at the bookstore where I was talking and talked about how family members and people that she knew in her family had robbed graves that were on her land, and that there had been a big fight back by the native tribes and rancherias in the local communities and so on. And she wanted to know if I knew anything about that because UC Berkeley was involved. So I promised her that I would go back to Berkeley and do some research on that, which I did, and found a lot of material inside the Berkeley archives, and then interviewed people that had familiarity with it up in Ukiah, and ended up writing that up and publishing that. And what that was about was that the rancheria in Ukiah, Ukiah Rancheria, that they actually hired lawyers, very high-level lawyers in the 1900s, to take on the University of California, particularly Berkeley, to get back things that had been plundered from their ancestral grave sites. And they won that battle. So that was very significant to find an example of an organized, legal, political fight taking place in the 1900s, long before there was any kind of organized efforts to deal with repatriation and so on. So I've always been on the lookout for that and always talked to people about that, and had the good fortune, particularly in Humboldt, of meeting, talking, and getting to know people who were very active in NICPA and told great stories about it and how they did that. And I think that's a very, it becomes an important theme of both books, of both The Scandal of Cal and Grave Matters, because it's so absent in what generations of students have received in textbooks and classrooms throughout the 20th century.
Yeah, and I think along with that, I mean the reputation, right, that Cal has. I know for me growing up, I was first generation, so I didn't, college itself was a little bit foreign, I kind of learning curve for me. But Berkeley, even being somebody outside academia, Berkeley was always kind of this bastion of, kind of liberal protests. I think I grew up kind of hearing about like the whole free speech movement and all these things. But Berkeley kind of as a city and as a university has this certain reputation as being this very liberal institution. And obviously that's a lot of what you're trying to challenge on this. And maybe we could talk a little bit about, well, there's a line, let me bring in this line that you have from the introduction that is very clearly central to this. You said the university's brutal relationship with tribes and native organizations, both in practice and in ideology, is foundational to its success. And maybe you could speak a little bit to that, the relationship of Berkeley, and again, possibly with Kroeber and, Ohlone peoples.
I was struck recently, the chancellor, who was appointed about a year ago, the new chancellor at Berkeley, Richard Lyons, was testifying before a congressional committee, one of the universities that's being called to account by Congress. And in his testimony to the federal congressional committee, and in a speech that he gave earlier, a few days earlier in Berkeley to the Berkeley City Club, trying out some of the ideas that he was going to be speaking about in Washington, D.C. He said, Berkeley has a reputation for being very radical, but what people don't know is the other side of Berkeley. And we need to be more proud of that. We need to be less shameful about the fact that Berkeley has a long relationship with issues of national security. We need to talk about how important Berkeley is in producing most of the young venture capitalists that come out of universities, and we need to take more pride in what the university really does. So in a sense, that's accurate. He was telling the accurate history. But there is a real long and very rich history of activism on the Berkeley campus, and I've been doing a lot more research on that since finishing The Scandal of Cal, going back really to the early 20th century. The first protest movements on campus were about obligatory military service, which was required of land grant universities. Berkeley began in the 1870s and had obligatory military service until the end of the 1950s. And there was continuous political opposition to that by students and organizing. There was tremendous organizing that went on the campus in the 1920s and 1930s about the university's military involvement, both in World War I and then the aftermath of World War I. There was a lot of political opposition, particularly in the 30s and afterwards, to racist practices and to eugenics on the Berkeley campus and so on. So there's a long history of that, and people tend to think about Berkeley activism as starting with the free speech movement. Whenever you read a history of Berkeley, it always seems to begin there. But the Berkeley free speech movement came out of a movement that was probably another 50 years old. And so Berkeley has been an important side of political activism, and a lot of the changes that have taken place at Berkeley for the good have been a result of that activism, have nothing at all to do with the university's leadership. The university's always been very reluctant about opening up the campus to political speech and political organizing, to disinvesting from the apartheid regime in South Africa, to responding to activists in the disability movement and the feminist movement and the anti-racism movement. All those movements had success over the many years at Berkeley, but had to go up against a very resistant administration. And the more I've read and learned about Berkeley, the more I think of Berkeley as being more corporate-like than public. It prides itself on being a public institution, but in fact it wouldn't have grown as quickly and as successfully as it did without massive private support, private endowments, private donations, philanthropy, and so on. The Hearst family is totally embroiled in the successful history of Berkeley as an institution. I mean, it started off as an agrarian college and very quickly imagined itself as another Harvard or being competitive with the great universities of Europe. And to do that, it had to bring in huge amounts of money from California elites, which it very successfully did. And then from the very beginning, Berkeley was a military campus. It recruited people that had been active in the Indian Wars, that had been active in the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. It opened the campus up to military operations during World War I. The campus basically became an accessory of the war during World War I. And of course, World War II, university doesn't like to talk about its central role in developing and then managing the implementation of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic weaponry, which it still continues to be very, very involved in the management of 3 national laboratories dealing with nuclear weapons research. You know, and there are other indicators of Berkeley's incredible wealth and importance. If you compared Berkeley to the major landowners in California, as I've just recently done, it comes up as like number 6 in terms of the most important landowners in the state. It has the University of California, including your campus of Santa Cruz, and the other 9 campuses, including Berkeley, and the medical facility, the medical research campuses. You're talking about an investment portfolio from the University of California that is about $169 billion. Has a team of about 50 people in a special office that do nothing but engage in investing UC money in all kinds of operations, including companies that manufacture military weapons and military operations in Israel and so on. So we're talking about really a very comprehensively conservative economic political institution run by a group of regents that have independent power in the California Constitution. Many people don't know that, but it has an independence from the legislature, from the governor, and the regents are basically responsible and are the owners of the universities and of the different campuses, and have enormous economic political power to make decisions without interference from the legislature or the governor's office. And I think really resemble more like a corporate entity than a public institution. So that people think of Berkeley as being kind of having this independent status, but really it's part of a larger corporate entity, and that it's really run by a board of regents that are not only represent economic power in the state, but some of the more conservative political power in the United States, and run campuses like absentee landlords, basically control all the major decisions around significant policies, around economics, around investment, around land, and so on, and yet are not absent in the day-to-day governance of the universities.
Mm. Yeah, so much stuff there. That's really great that you're uncovering all this. Connected with that, I'm thinking about, you talk about in the book a lot of these connections with Los Alamos, and but also you tie those both together in kind of this idea about land grab universities. And I know that's something that's kind of been talked about recently or highlighted in different studies. But I wonder if you can talk about that aspect of your study.
Yeah, so in the mythology of the University of California, and particularly Berkeley, the Land Grant Act, which happened in the 1860s, this was the federal government under Abraham Lincoln, basically taking over lands throughout the country that had been forcibly abandoned by indigenous tribes, particularly in California, as a result of genocide and decimation. Lands were just, they had to abandon historic villages and so on. So those lands were taken over. They were described as public lands, as being accessible lands, as being free lands, but in fact they were stolen lands, as we now know. And the money from those investments and from that land was given to land-grant colleges all over the United States, including the University of California, that then were given that money, not necessarily to start universities on the land that had been taken, but were given that money to invest. And they could sell the land, they could rent the land, they could use it for startups, they could bring in partners for economic development and so on. And that money, for example, at Berkeley for the first several decades of the university, and at that time Berkeley was the only campus of the University of California for about the first 40 or 50 years until UCLA developed. That money played a critical role in the startup of the administration of the universities. So that money plus the money of the Hearst family and other private investors in the university, that was the foundational. Some money coming from plunder, some money coming from great wealth. And then the mythology of that was that this was public money and it was done in the public interest and so on. And Berkeley and other land-grant colleges began to just tell the story as if this was like an example of the shift of wealth to public interests and to people that had never been to college before, when in fact it was really an act of plunder.
Yeah. And again, it's such important stuff that doesn't get talked about enough, right? I don't think people think about how we get into the situation we do with universities owning so much of these lands and having so much control. One of the things that we focused on a lot in this podcast, the last season we did episodes about salvage anthropology, where we were talking to folks like Kutcher Risling-Baldy and others. And in Kroeber, we did a whole episode on Kroeber, a little bit with Ishii. And in there, we were really trying to get kind of the perspectives of Indigenous Californians on these legacies and talk to people whose ancestors had worked with Kroeber or been informants. As you know, of course, kind of the name Kroeber has, and you talk about this in here too, come under some scrutiny. And in more recent years, there's been the changing of Kroeber Hall, which we covered in the podcast, and then there's been back and forth on that. I know there's been some studies, people have come out to kind of defend Kroeber within the anthropological world. I wonder if you could weigh in a little bit and talk a little bit about what you found with Kroeber and your thoughts on Kroeber and his legacy.
Yeah, I think Kroeber is a really fascinating individual. And that I was surprised when I started doing research for Grave Matters and then for The Scandal of Cal that there are no serious biographies of Kroeber. So those of you thinking about dissertations and first books and so on, this just cries out to be done, because he's complicated, and there's a lot about his inner life, his psychological life that's been written. There's been a lot written about his work in the university and so on. And there was a huge division on the Berkeley campus and elsewhere about whether or not his name should be taken off the building, the anthropology building, called Kroeber Hall at the time. And I supported efforts to remove his name. Those efforts were led by Indigenous organizations and students on the campus and in the community to do that. And largely because in the Bay Area of important work that he did, which basically described people as being disappeared and gone, and he wasn't particularly interested in Bay Area Indigenous tribes. I mean, he was very, very close to the Yurok and Northern California Indigenous communities and did a great deal of work there, but he was pretty dismissive of the history and legacy and contributions of Bay Area tribes. And a lot of tribes were furious, correctly, about that and supported campaigns to get his name off the building. My view was based on the role that he played as chairman of the anthropology department. He was the de facto chair of the department in the 1900s when he first came in as what today would be called an assistant professor. There were other people that were chairing and running it. In fact, the main person running the anthropology department in the 1900s was Phoebe Hearst. Phoebe Hearst didn't just give money to the university and say, I'd like this money to be used in anthropology. She actually directly managed and funded the anthropology department. the anthropology department in its annual budget would write up a proposal and would send it to her, and then she would send the money directly to them. So she was very hands-on in the way she ran things here. And Kroeber was basically he was like a gopher, but he was basically running things before he became an assistant professor, and then later on the director, the chair of the department, and so on. But he was chair of the department for decades, and there's a lot being said that we have to understand the important work that he did on protecting languages, on respecting his contacts, in trying to develop a more respectful kinds of relationships that the university would have with the survivors of genocide and so on. All of that's true. But he was also, and in the book, this is the argument that I make, and this is what I try to add to the discussions about Kroeber and his complexity, that as chair of the department for decades, he oversighted the department that amassed one of the largest collections of human remains in the country. If not, I think it's probably the largest. Berkeley, in the book, I make the case that Berkeley undercounted human remains, ancestral remains, because they basically just dug into grave sites and put bones together and broke up the skeletons. And then when they brought them back to the Berkeley campus, even if there were more intact skeletons and crania and so on, that they would then break them up into different parts and put them into a box of legs and a box of arms and a box of heads and so on. And then they would sort of speculate as to what the number was. So at the height, their number was about 10 to 11,000, which is very high. But I think realistically, it's probably more in the 20,000. So here we're talking about then something that ranks alongside the Smithsonian and the major institutions in Europe that were doing comparable digs and excavations and plunder in the colonies of the European nations. Kroeber's role in this was to oversight this and to encourage it. And also he brought in and trained Gilman. Gilman was the main eugenicist in the anthropology department. And whatever Kroeber's criticisms were of eugenics, and he would occasionally speak out against biological eugenics ideas, whatever his distaste was for what was going on in the digging up of ancestral remains, he oversighted that department for many, many decades. And in the early development of the university, that was a key and central aspect of what the university was proud of. I mean, anthropology declined, after World War II as a sort of powerhouse in academia. But between the end of the 19th century and through World War I and right up to World War II, anthropology was a very central part of how the university defined itself. And the university took pride in the number of graves that were being dug up and proudly included it in its annual reports and talked about how many they had and how big it was and so on. And, when I wrote Grave Matters, I used to think that that this was all motivated by scientific racism, because they did some assessment and investigation of different skulls and tried to come up with these racial mumbo-jumbo ideas about the superiority of white civilization and so on. But for the most part, I would say for 95% or more of ancestral remains and so on, they just dumped them into boxes and crates and put them in basements and kept them in different parts of the campus and so on. And so I began to understand what they were doing was really taking pride in the accumulation of what were ancestral remains and cultural artifacts. And we're very proud to talk about how many bodies they brought in and how many corpses they dug up and so on. So it was more like plunder, and more like the way that people accumulate objects and things and show off how many they have. That Berkeley took pride in that, and that was a very central part of the university for several decades. So I hold Kroeber responsible for that as the department chair, and he was the department chair like any department chairs of powerful departments. You negotiate and you juggle all these different elements of it, And on the one hand, he's protecting languages and bringing in consultants, indigenous consultants, and so on. And then on the other hand, he's encouraging the hoarding of tens of thousands of human remains from graves and getting the money for expeditions that did that. So when people say that's contradictory, well, yes, human beings are contradictory and Kroger's contradictory too. But that's a pretty major thing that he did. And no doubt he had his psychological moments of worry about that in the same way that, after Oppenheimer was deeply involved in the dropping of the atomic bomb in Japan and had his doubts and worries after he did that. Nevertheless, they both participated in that, and they both did that, and they both have to be held responsible for it.
Yeah. And, I think a really important part of that too. Well, a couple of things. I mean, a lot of those, not all, but a lot of those bodies, those, the grave sites that they dug up were part of the shell mounds, right? The extensive shell mounds that were throughout the whole Bay Area, that most of which have been destroyed, and some of which recently, thanks to the work of Karina Gould and the East Bay indigenous community, the villages of Lashawn, have fought so hard to protect what remains of these, right? The West Berkeley shell mound and such. But I think it's worth stating too that a lot of those, most of those burials, as far as I understand, haven't been repatriated, right? Are still in collections at Berkeley, still being held by the Phoebe Hearst Museum, as I understand it, right? Which ties back to your conversation about her.
Yeah, the university has closed down the Hearst Museum. They said it was temporary, but it's been a long time now. It's been well over a year. And basically it said that they put all their staff into dealing with repatriation. But the repatriation has been very slow. And also, as you well know, it takes a lot of money and resources and time and expertise for tribes to repatriate. You have to have expertise, you have to have places to store human remains and artifacts. You have to have ceremonies to take care of them. You have to consult and bring in the elder community and to see what they do. It's a very slow, difficult, painful process. When I went to speak to the cultural committee of elders at the Yurok tribe when I was working on grave matters, told them what I was working on, people just started crying. I mean, this is so painful and so close to what people know, and that they've heard stories from people that knew this happened, and people talked about this happening to their ancestors and their relatives. The university's finally begun to comply. I mean, they were supposed to comply with this within 5 years of the passage of the federal legislation in 1990, and they've still not complied with it. They're beginning to, publish, which they're required to do in the Federal Register, to publish collections that are there for repatriation. But they've not come clean about acknowledging how all the human remains were mixed together, how they didn't keep decent records of anything. I mean, it just adds, horrors to what they did in the first place. They've not accounted for that. They've not publicly apologized for that. They've not pondered about why and how that happened. There's been no reckoning on the Berkeley campus with one of the most horrendous aspects of California history. And they've not really come clean about being on land that was actually occupied by Ohlone, and which they've known that ever since the university began. So when they started building on the university campus, building very quickly and digging up land and so on, they dug up human remains and artifacts all over the campus. That wasn't a secret because they knew about it, and also some of the local press at the time wrote about it. It was just seen as a curiosity. People were going around digging up all over the place on the campus and so on. And to this day, we know a great deal about exactly where the village sites were. It's not a secret. Everybody knows about it and talks about it. And there's a place on campus where there's a shell mound. And on that shell mound today, the university encourages students to roll down it. It's sort of a student ritual to roll down this hill on campus. It's called the 4.0 Hill. And so when the campus tours take families and parents and visitors on the tour of the campus, which I've been on, they take you past this hill, and they tell these stories about how this is where the students like to roll down the hill, because if they roll down it, it's going to bring them luck and get them good grades and so on. They tell it sort of like a part of the lore of the campus. So there's nothing there to say that this was a shell mound, this was a burial ground. It's still a burial ground. And the university's done nothing to discourage people from that kind of ritual that they do. There's also a statue on the esplanade, a memorial, that's got like a round concrete ball on it, and that's called the 4.0 ball. Students, when they go and take their exams, and everybody knows about this. All the students I talked to around the campus and said, well, what's this, or what's it for? They say, oh, that's the 4.0 ball, and you're supposed to touch it before you go in for your exams. It'll bring you luck. And when you go around on the campus tour, the official campus tours, they also tell you about that too. So that was actually a memorial put up in the early 1900s to the man who was the campus armorer. He was in charge of all the weapon systems on campus. And he came out of the Indian Wars and received a congressional award for basically hunting down and killing Native Americans in the Indian Wars too. And this round concrete ball actually represents a cannonball. So there's nothing about this at the memorial, and you can't blame students for doing this without knowing any better or knowing any different. And that when I talk to students and tell them what it is, it changes their relationship to the place. It changes their attitude about doing that, and they sort of shiver. Like, oh my God, for luck, we're now supposed to touch something that is associated with somebody who killed indigenous people, and the university takes pride in that and makes it into sort of the folklore of the campus. So once people know this history and know these kinds of examples, it changes their attitude about it. But the university as an institution has done nothing to make that knowledge known.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it echoes, the history of, which recently, or somewhat recently, with Madley and, Brendan Lindsay and other studies, right, that started to kind of expose how present kind of after the end of the Civil War, the Indian Wars that were here, and how much of the U.S. military was employed in the massacres and horrific things that were happening in California. So, yeah, I think your book does a great job of connecting that to Cal as an institution, how they embrace that, and really, and it echoes with this erasure that you talk about there. Something that comes to mind, and you gestured towards this before, but it's just worth noting, like, not only was Kroeber's role with all of the things that you mentioned too, but, specifically with the Ohlone people, right? Of course, he very infamously made these declarations in his handbook about how the Ohlone people were effectively extinct. And he said that knowing that he had talked to a lot of the Ohlone people in the area, right? And he was well aware of these descendants, but of course, it kind of didn't fit with his ideas of, this whole salvage anthropology stuff there.
Yeah.
So there's that layer too of not only kind of taking these lands, not really working with the Ohlone, but even actively working against them, because those declarations, as you know, have made it so difficult for contemporary Ohlone peoples to get federal recognition or any of these things, because it worked very much against that.
Kroeber, I think, has to be held responsible because of the power of his role and his influence, and he was famous. But he refused to educate journalists and popular writers who both erased the history of resistance, but also developed this trope of the disappearing Indian. He absolutely knew better about those things. And he promoted the view that anthropology should be about the indigenous history and the indigenous past, and that anything happened afterwards was really not the province of anthropology. It was the province of historians and political scientists and so on. So I think that decision that he took had profound influence on the textbooks, on the popular stories, on the proliferation of anecdotes and stories about disappearing and non-resisting Indians and so on. That had a deep impact. And he also influenced then all the young assistant professors that worked in that department to stay away from talking about those topics too. So I think that's another aspect of his that we should look at in terms of what does it mean to be a responsible intellectual? What does it mean to be a public intellectual? And he was called upon to testify in different places. He gave speeches all over the place and so on. So he could have spoken out on this. And he wasn't the only one responsible for this, but given his significance, given his power, given his prestige, I think he had a lot of responsibility which he didn't take.
Mm. Yeah. Thinking of you gave us a little bit of an update of where Berkeley's at these days in terms of starting the process of repatriation. And I know you personally have been involved with, for example, and we linked to this in previous podcasts, but that really excellent ProPublica series that came out a little while back, the study into that, right, that was basically ended up kind of creating some movement to put pressure on Berkeley to start addressing that. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little and maybe tell us a little bit about the Berkeley's Truth and Justice Project.
Well, I wish I would have good news about this. I think the political crisis of the last year or so and the attack on universities has basically shifted these kinds of issues to the back burner or off the stove altogether. The University of California, Berkeley brought in a new chancellor whose expertise is in business, in venture capital, in investments, which I think said a great deal about what the priorities of the university. That everything is now about trying to protect grants, defend the university. And I think the university has moved, we haven't seen a lot of publicity about this, but I think Berkeley has moved very quickly to comply with the kinds of demands that the Trump administration has made on Columbia and other places. New faculty being interviewed for jobs and coming in for new positions no longer have to say what they think about issues of inequality and diversity and so on, and equity. That's now gone. New students coming in now have to take an obligatory training on anti-Semitism. The university talks about this incredible increase of anti-Semitism on the campus without any documentation, any research to back that up. No investigations. The Berkeley campus has, like your campus, has many people who are experts on polling and survey research. None of them have been brought in to actually look at this. The assumption is that there's been this incredible increase in anti-Semitism, assuming that anti-Semitism by this definition has to do with criticisms of Israel and so on, and that's now become a fact on the ground. University has also banned and restricted demonstrations on campus, that students are not allowed to wear masks, they're not allowed to camp overnight, that they have to go through a very rigorous process of getting permission to have a demonstration or to hold any kind of event on campus, or where they can table on campus and so on. The university's always done this throughout the 20th century, but now there's a lot more rules and regulations about this. And so the whole priorities of the university, I would say that repatriation was never a priority, but there was efforts over the last few years. The Truth and Justice Project and other groups on campus got the university to acknowledge what had happened and say we must do something about it, and to slowly and, in my view, inadequately begin to deal with it. The university didn't pass an official land acknowledgement, but encouraged different departments and organizations in the university to do a land acknowledgement, which is probably better than nothing, though it's a very generic land acknowledgement. It doesn't specify that this actual land that the university is on was an Ohlone, was a Ohlone village site for 2,000 years, maybe longer. So all of those things, all of those efforts have pretty much gone. And the Truth and Justice Project, one of the key people was not hired for an important faculty position, and she left. And most of the faculty now is sort of organizing to try to protect grants and federal money and also to comply with the Trump administration. So that's become the new priority. And once again, the issues of the indigenous history of the university, repatriation, racist practices and policies that link Native American history with other histories of people of color on the campus, all of those things are now sort of disappeared as a priority.
There's like these brief moments where with enough pressure, the university is able to start to come around to at least, in words, acknowledging some of this stuff and move that way. And then uh, of course, that gets relegated to the back burner and taken off completely. Yeah,
Yeah, and um, you know, I do think there was important efforts that were made in the last 5 years, and the university began to say we need to deal with this. At least the university began to talk that way. And in previous books, Grave Matters, for example, the university sort of dismissed what I had to say and didn't want to discuss it. There are people in the administration that have read The Scandal of Cal, and I've had meetings with them, and they brought me in to talk to all the what they call communicators, which is the public relations people on campus, of which there's about 70 or 80 at one point. So there was that kind of response, and more people will say to me, well, you know, we don't disagree with what you said, but, you know, now we have other priorities and other things that need to be done. So once again, it gets limited. And, when you look at the history of Native American struggles in California, that when I was learning about this and being taught what I should have known already, that Native leaders would say to me, it's a matter of patience. This is taking a long, long time. We're used to this. Took a long time before the word genocide was used to describe, what's happened to Native people in the middle of the 19th century. These things take a long time. It's a long, long, difficult, slow process. But this does feel like a setback now on these issues that you're concerned about, that I'm concerned about, that tribes are concerned about. And this makes me think now much more clearly about how the kind of research that I've been doing, that other people like me and yourself do, that for this to have any kind of effective impact in an institution like Berkeley or the University of California requires political activism to accompany it. It's not going to just happen unless there's pressure from below. And there's a long history of that on the Berkeley campus in particular that goes way back before the free speech movement, and there will be in the future. But for right now, this is a moment of people just trying to figure out what to do and how to fight back and how to organize in this very momentous and difficult moment.
Yeah, it's absolutely needed, and I think, I mean, in many ways, I mean, that's kind of how, when I used to teach U.S. history classes before coming to the film department, one of the things that we'd focus on was how, change only has happened in the history of this country from a bottom-up point of view, right? It's only when enough pressure has come from organizing, people getting together, that the people on top have been pressured into making these changes, right, from the civil rights to any kind of progressive change we can think of in our history. So, yeah, it's right in line with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Berkeley now, if you look at the public relations and the way that Berkeley describes itself, we are the University of Free Speech, the free speech movement. So it's sort of co-opted that, it doesn't talk about the ways in which the university tried to stop the free speech movement, discipline people, expel people. There's a little plaque for Mario Savio, which is hard to find in Sproul Plaza, but doesn't say who he was or what he did or what the university did to him. So they've co-opted that as part of the law of the university, like we really believe in free speech and so on. So it's and when you talk to people about University of California, particularly Berkeley, that's one of the things they talk about, that Berkeley stands for free speech, where as opposed to activists on the campus have always fought for free political speech, not just any speech, but free political speech. That's been a long-standing battle for about 100 years, and that people that fight for that often pay the price. So that's part of the mythology of the Berkeley campus. And one of the things that I hoped unreasonably is that the university might make the book I did part of required readings for freshmen when they come into the campus. There's all kinds of programs, and probably is at Santa Cruz for new students that come in. They have to read certain things, discuss them, and so on. But there's none of this kind of education going on with the new students. So they're now going to be educated about the need to fight anti-Semitism without being explained to them why they think anti-Semitism is a serious problem on the Berkeley campus. And so I assume this new group of students coming in will think, oh, yeah, this must have been a big issue on the Berkeley campus, and there must have been incredible anti-Semitism for us to have to be, trained in this and briefed on this, without the university talking about the definition of anti-Semitism or the lack of evidence that this has been a growing problem on the Berkeley campus.
Yeah, or the conflation of these ideas of anti-Semitism with critique of the state of Israel or genocide and all those things, which of course is what happens, right, with that conflation, is it kind of obscures
Yeah.
what the protests, what the movements were about, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this has had a very chilling effect. I don't know about your campus, but the Berkeley academics are very concerned about what they're saying on these issues. And now the regents are considering a new policy, which is being discussed, which would make faculty responsible for statements they make in their capacity as individual citizens and off campus about political events. So, if I signed a petition, which I do, defending the rights of Palestinians or talking about Israeli genocide and so on, and do that in my capacity as an activist in the Berkeley community or with political organizations, I could be held accountable for that by the university in the same way as if I was standing on Sproul Plaza. So I think this has had a profound impact on faculty. And as I said at the beginning when we started talking, I was really struck by the failure of academics at Berkeley to seriously investigate the university itself, whereas doing very critical studies of other places. And I think that kind of chill and that kind of conscious amnesia is going to be even stronger now in this moment, until there's a new movement and new struggles and new organizing that goes on. But it's going to take a while to recover from the current moment.
Yeah, and as you pointed out with these examples from the 60s, I mean, I think if we know this pattern, and what'll happen is they'll kind of crack down on protesters and resistors, and then 20 years from now they'll fundraise on that, and they'll get money for drawing attention to the movement that they were crushing before.
Yeah,
you kind of lead to a place. We could have started with this, but I think it's worth asking and just having you talk a little bit about your relationship. I know you talk about in the book kind of your relationship with the city of Berkeley and with the University of Berkeley and all that, but maybe you can speak a little bit about, and I know that's what drew you into these studies, right, into the both the Grave Matters and this one, but maybe you could kind of offer here at the end a little bit of kind of your relationship and how that kind of brought you into this.
So right now we're up in a wonderful place called Big Lagoon. It's in Humboldt. It's one of the first of several lagoons along the coast. It's Yurok and Wiyot country. This was a part of California that was really decimated by the genocide and managed to resist the Spanish mission system because it was more remote and hard for the Spanish colonial regime to get to, but the genocide and the gold rush made it possible for military and armed citizens to come through and to basically destroy many indigenous sites here and village sites and so on. So I've been coming to Big Lagoon for a long time, and it's a beautiful place. I did know something generally about the indigenous history of the area. I didn't know until I started working on Grave Matters that there was actually a grave site maybe, quarter of a mile from where I'm talking to you now, and that had been dug up by amateur archaeologists, and also that the Berkeley Anthropology Department sent archaeologists here to dig up here. I didn't know about that until somebody shared it with me. And about that time, our son, who'd been ill for many years, he reached 40 years old, but he died, and he asked for, after his death, he wanted to be associated with Big Lagoon. He loved this place. So his ashes are actually scattered in Big Lagoon, and during that whole process of thinking about memorials and ceremonies for him and the association of his death with this place, I began to read up on Yurok history and Yurok memorials and Yurok cultural ceremonies, and discovered that sort of what we did with Daniel's remains were very similar to the way that the Big Lagoon residents, indigenous residents, buried their dead and thought about their dead and thought about the lagoon and so on. So that was the beginning of me trying to then think more seriously about my responsibility as an academic that teaches a lot about race and racism, that what responsibility do I have with that? And then I started working with helped to create a coalition of cabin owners and tribal representatives and county representatives. We would come together and and spent about 2 years talking about how to protect that land and how to make sure it didn't get dug up anymore by tourists, and the possibility of making it a place where there could be cultural ceremonies in the future here. So I began to, that began as that political project to protect that land. And then, being an academic, being a political intellectual, I then began to do more research on it to try to understand how that happened and who was involved in that trade. And that eventually led to the book Grave Matters, and ended up me understanding the role of Berkeley anthropology in that. At that point, I'd not studied the history of anthropology and not read up much on it. And Indigenous history of California was sort of secondary to the other racisms that I was very, very familiar with. So I began to take that a lot more responsibly, and began to think a lot more deeply about that and to work on that. So, the political connection, the personal connection, then became a very deep and important part of the intellectual work, and that runs through Grave Matters, and then it runs through the second book too, because of my role in being on the Berkeley campus and being around the Berkeley campus for a long time and not knowing this history, and then feeling a responsibility to have to do something about that. So the two books really are like the bookends of what I've learned, and also that there's so much more to learn. I mean, I'm, as I said before, I've begun to look more deeply recently into the economy and the politics of the University of California, and the history of the regents, and the economic holdings. I've done more research, for example, on the Berkeley Annex in Richmond, which has a whole important history, is also built on Ohlone land, and was also dug up by Berkeley anthropologists, which I didn't know about until I started doing research on that. So there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. I mean, this is the beginning of investigations and research, but I think connecting the research to personal responsibility, if you're an academic, and connecting it to political struggles is key to understand that, because without that, I don't think we can be effective.
Mm. Yeah, well, I think you've done such important work, and like you said, there's so much more to do, right? There always is, but it's helpful. I think the types of studies you've done kind of help open the doors and point the ways towards other things that are next to look at, right? Maybe the last question I'll ask you for this is, and you did talk a little bit about your hopes and goals with this study, but I wonder if you could just kind of speak a little bit about, what are your hopes and goals with this particular book, The Scandal at Cal?
Well, my hope with The Scandal of Cal is that in terms of academics and progressive intellectuals, to begin to understand how you don't have to go off the campus to do research and writing, that this is something to do. There are risks involved with it. The university does not encourage this kind of research. But I think if you're a progressive intellectual these days on any campus, and you want to do intellectual work and research work that links up with your political responsibilities and political identity, there's going to be risks involved. It's not like you can do both and there not be risks involved. So my hope is that other people will take this on. I also work with faculty over the last few years that developed courses on the history of eugenics and racial issues on the Berkeley campus. Taught a class in the law school, which had students doing research on Native history of the university. I taught a class last semester also in the law school on how the university historically has dealt with protests and going back to the early part of the 20th century. I worked with another professor who developed a class on the history of eugenics on the Berkeley campus. So students really appreciated these courses and really developed them. There was nothing like it in the curriculum. I know there are other places, for example, at Yale, where there's a lot of important work going on the history of eugenics, and at other universities. There's a whole network of academics in the United States and in other countries around the world that are now doing serious work on the history of eugenics. And eugenics, I think, is one of the intellectual keys to researching how we think about Indigenous history as well. So that's a real breakthrough. That's very important, and that's happening. There's articles being written about the history of eugenics in California now that when we started working on this 15, 20 years ago, there was nothing. People know what eugenics means now. In terms of getting administrations to seriously take on these issues in ways that it requires. I mean, you can't just set up a committee or provide a new policy or make a sort of generic apology statement. This requires a deep investigation and reckoning, somewhat similar to the way that a few East Coast universities are beginning to deal with the legacies of the slave trade, on how they got going, Harvard and Yale and Georgetown and so on. Something comparable to that, where you stop business as usual and say, what does this mean to have this history and this past, aside from the mythic history of Berkeley and UC and so on? What does this mean and what do we do about it? And to make sure that all the people at the table who have been affected by this history are at the table for this discussion and this reckoning. And in California and at Berkeley, that has to be Indigenous representatives and communities and tribes and so on. So I think it's pretty clear what we need to do, but there's then also going to have to be political organizing to make that happen. I don't think it will happen without that. And I think when COVID shut down the campuses and students were not around, we're still recovering from that. I mean, Berkeley, for example, has a very rich history of political activism and political organizing, but I think that really disrupted it. And now the university is trying to stop it even before it even begins, so it's going to be much harder to do that. But I'm hopeful that people will continue that struggle. And also as part of that, I think I'd like to see a lot more education at Berkeley, but also at UCLA, to understand the history of student political movements on these campuses, because yes, you've got this sort of token appreciation of the free speech movement and when it began. You have Angela Davis at Santa Cruz and so on. The more important parts of the recent history, but I'd like to see students learning a lot more about the deep history, about the way the university tried to curtail political protests, but also how there's a very rich, complicated history, the disability movement, the anti-investment in apartheid movement, the feminist movement, the ethnic studies movements, the movements against militarism and obligatory military service. I mean, this is a real window into the history of American progressive movements, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface of understanding that.
Challenging Colonialism is produced by myself, Daniel Stoneblum, and Martin Rizzo-Martinez. All interviews by Martin, all audio engineering and editing by Daniel, all music by G. Gonzalez, and logo art and animation is by Professor John Hotalianos. Follow us on Twitter, subscribe to the podcast, rate and review on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening.